When tech mogul Harrison Blackwood's will was read in a downtown Chicago law office, the silence was deafening. His 3 children, his business partners, his charitable foundations, none of them inherited a single dollar. Instead, the entire $4.2 billion fortune went to Rosa Martinez, a 52-year-old maid who had worked in his mansion for exactly 7 years. The family screamed fraud. The lawyers called it impossible. But what they discovered about Rosa's true identity would change everything they thought they knew about the man who built an empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th, 2023 started like any other at the Blackwood estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. Rosa Martinez arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, her worn Honda Civic pulling through the iron gates she'd passed through every weekday for 7 years. She carried the same faded canvas bag, wore the same practical shoes, and tied her graying hair back in the same simple bun she'd worn since Harrison Blackwood first hired her in 2016. At 78 years old, Harrison had built Nexus Technologies from nothing into one of the world's largest software companies. His mansion sat on 12 acres overlooking Lake Michigan, filled with priceless art, rare books, and technology that most people couldn't even comprehend. But to Rosa, it was simply her workplace, rooms to clean, floors to polish, and a routine that never varied. That morning felt different, though she couldn't explain why. Harrison hadn't come down for his usual 7 a.m. coffee. His study door remained closed, and the house held an unusual stillness that made Rosa's movements echo louder than normal. She knocked gently on his door, calling out in the respectful tone she'd always used. No response. After waiting several minutes, she used her master key, something Harrison had entrusted her with years earlier. Much to his family's dismay, she found him seated in his leather chair, facing the massive windows that looked out over the lake. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping, but Rosa had seen death before. Her hands trembling, she called 911, then sat quietly in the hallway outside his study, waiting for the authorities to arrive. The Blackwood children descended on the estate within hours. Marcus, the eldest at 45, had always been the aggressive one, constantly pushing his father to retire so he could take control of the company. He strode through the mansion like he already owned it, barking orders at Rosa as if she were an inconvenience to be managed. Patricia, 42, had built her own successful interior design firm, but never stopped hoping for her father's approval and his money. She moved through the rooms with calculating eyes, mentally cataloguing everything of value. The youngest, David, 38, had disappointed his father by choosing academia over business. But that didn't stop him from showing up with his lawyer wife, both of them clearly expecting their share of the inheritance. None of them spoke to Rosa except to dismiss her or question why she was still there. They treated her as they always had, as invisible help, someone whose presence was necessary but unremarkable. She continued her duties quietly, cleaning around the family meetings, the constant phone calls to lawyers and accountants, the heated discussions about funeral arrangements and business succession. The funeral was a spectacle. Tech industry leaders, politicians, and celebrities filled the massive cathedral in downtown Chicago. Rosa sat in the very back, wearing her only black dress, watching as speaker after speaker praised Harrison Blackwood's brilliance, his philanthropy, his vision. Marcus delivered a eulogy that painted his father as a devoted family man, conveniently omitting the years of bitter arguments and the fact that Harrison had barely spoken to his children in the months before his death. Throughout the service, Rosa noticed how the family positioned themselves for the cameras, how they spoke to reporters about carrying on Harrison's legacy, how they seemed more concerned with the optics than with genuine grief. She had seen Harrison in his final months, had witnessed his increasing isolation from his family, his disappointment in their constant demands for money, and their complete lack of interest in the work that had defined his life. 3 days after the funeral, The family gathered at the law offices of Steinberg, Rothschild and Associates, for the reading of the will. The firm's senior partner, Edmund Steinberg, had handled Harrison's affairs for over 30 years. The mahogany-paneled conference room was packed, the three Blackwood children and their spouses, Harrison's younger brother Thomas, who had flown in from California, several key executives from Nexus Technologies, and representatives from the various charities Harrison had supported over the years. Rosa almost didn't attend. The invitation had come as a surprise. Harrison's assistant had called her personally, explaining that Mr. Blackwood had specifically requested her presence at the will reading. She assumed she might receive a small request, perhaps enough to cover a few months of expenses while she looked for new employment. She certainly never expected to be seated in the same room as the family and business elite who would inherit billions. Edmund. Steinberg cleared his throat and began reading in the formal tone that lawyers perfect over decades of practice. The first few items were standard: personal effects to family members, small bequests to longtime employees, donations to Harvard Business School and several medical research foundations. The family listened with barely contained impatience, clearly waiting for the main event. Then Steinberg reached the crucial paragraph, and his voice faltered slightly. He read it twice, as if he couldn't believe the words on the page. To Rosa Elena Martinez, who has shown me more loyalty, kindness, and genuine care in 7 years than I have received from anyone else in my entire life, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all shares in Nexus Technologies, all real property, all financial assets, and all personal property not otherwise specified in this document. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus was the first to react, jumping to his feet and shouting about fraud, about his father's mental state, about the impossibility of what they'd just heard. Patricia began crying, whether from shock or fury was unclear. David sat frozen, his face pale, while his lawyer wife frantically scribbled notes. Rosa felt like the room was spinning. She had never owned anything of significant value in her entire life. Born in a small village in El Salvador, she had immigrated to the United States in her 20s with nothing but hopes for a better life. She had cleaned houses, worked in restaurants, raised 3 children as a single mother, and saved every penny she could. The idea of inheriting billions of dollars was so far beyond her comprehension that she wondered if she had misheard. But Steinberg continued reading, and the details became clear. Not only had Harrison left Rosa everything, but he had structured the inheritance to make it nearly impossible to contest. He had undergone extensive psychological evaluations in the months before his death, all confirming his mental competency. He had created detailed video testimonials explaining his decision. He had even established a legal team specifically to defend the will against any challenges. As the family's shock turned to rage, Rosa found herself remembering moments from the past 7 years that suddenly took on new meaning. The way Harrison had always asked about her children's progress in school, how he had quietly arranged for her son Miguel to receive a scholarship to Northwestern University, the times he had asked her opinion on business matters, something that had puzzled her, but that she now realized had been genuine interest in her perspective. She remembered the conversations they'd had during his final months, when his health was declining and the family visits had become increasingly tense. Harrison had told her stories about building his company, about the mistakes he'd made, about his regrets regarding his relationship with his children. He had spoken about feeling surrounded by people who only wanted his money, who saw him as a resource rather than as a person. Rosa, he had said one afternoon while she was organizing his books, "You're the only person who looks at me and sees just Harrison, not Harrison Blackwood the billionaire. Do you know how rare that is?" At the time, she had thought he was simply being kind. Now she understood he had been trying to tell her something much more profound. The chaos that erupted in the law office was unlike anything Edmund Steinberg had witnessed in 4 decades of practice. Marcus Blackwood overturned his chair, screaming at Rosa in a mixture of English and what he apparently thought was Spanish, demanding she confess to manipulating his father. Patricia collapsed into hysterical sobs, wailing about how this would destroy the family legacy. David, typically the most controlled of the siblings, sat in stunned silence, methodically tearing his legal pad into strips. Rosa remained perfectly still throughout the outburst, her hands folded in her lap, watching the family she had served for 7 years transform into something she barely recognized. Thomas Blackwood, Harrison's brother, was the only family member who didn't join the hysteria. Instead, he studied Rosa with curious eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. "There has to be an explanation," Thomas finally said, his voice cutting through the noise. Harrison was many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. He didn't make $4 billion decisions on whims. Steinberg cleared his throat and reached for a sealed envelope that had been paper-clipped to the back of the will. Actually, Mr. Blackwood anticipated this reaction. He left specific instructions for me to play a video recording immediately after reading the will. He said, and I quote, "They'll need to understand the why before they can accept the what." A large screen descended from the ceiling, and suddenly Harrison Blackwood was in the room with them, recorded just 3 weeks before his death. He sat in his study, the same room where Rosa had found him, looking directly into the camera with the sharp intelligence that had built an empire. "If you're watching this," Harrison began, his voice strong despite his frail appearance, "then Rosa has just inherited everything I've worked my entire life to build. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're saying. And I know that most of you believe I've lost my mind." Marcus started to interrupt, but Steinberg held up a hand for silence. "The truth is, I've never been more clear-headed in my life. For the past 7 years, I've been conducting an experiment, though Rosa never knew it. I wanted to understand what kind of person she really was, beneath the quiet exterior and the humble background that my family has always used as an excuse to dismiss her." On screen, Harrison reached for a thick folder. "What I discovered changed my entire perspective on success, on family, and on what truly matters. Rosa Martinez isn't just my maid. She's the most remarkable person I've ever met. And I suspect none of you have ever bothered to really see her." The video continued as Harrison began revealing details about Rosa's life that stunned everyone in the room. She hadn't just immigrated from El Salvador. She'd been a civil engineer there, graduated summa cum laude from the National University. She had been forced to flee the country in 1995 when her husband, a journalist investigating government corruption, was murdered. She had arrived in Chicago with 3 young children and no legal status, unable to practice her profession, taking whatever work she could find to survive. "Rosa never told me any of this directly," Harrison explained. "I had to piece it together over years, through careful observation and discreet investigation. Do you know what I found? In her spare time, Rosa has been volunteering at a community center, teaching math and science to immigrant children. She's been sending money back to El Salvador to support an orphanage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. She's been taking English classes at night, not to improve her job prospects, but to better help her son with his college applications. Marcus's face had gone from red with rage to pale with shock. Patricia had stopped crying and was staring at the screen with her mouth open. Harrison's voice grew stronger. "But here's what really convinced me that Rosa deserved everything I have to give. 3 years ago, when I was going through my cancer treatments, I was at my lowest point. The chemotherapy made me sick, confused, and sometimes irrational. One evening I accused Rosa of stealing from me. I said terrible things, questioned her integrity, threatened to have her deported." Rosa closed her eyes, remembering that awful night. She had gone home in tears, certain she would be fired, wondering how she would support her family. "The next morning," Harrison continued, "Rosa came to work as usual. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't quit in righteous anger, as she had every right to do. Instead, she brought me tea and toast, helped me to my chair and said, "Mr. Blackwood, you are not feeling well today. When you are better, we will talk." That was it. No drama, no demands for apologies, no wounded pride. Just compassion for a sick, frightened old man who had treated her shamefully. The recording showed Harrison pausing to wipe his eyes. I realized that day that Rosa possessed something my billions couldn't buy: genuine grace under pressure. She had found a way to maintain her dignity while showing me kindness I didn't deserve. But Harrison wasn't finished. He revealed that Rosa had been quietly solving problems around the estate that had baffled expensive consultants. When the mansion's climate control system malfunctioned, costing thousands in repairs, Rosa had identified the real issue: a simple airflow problem that she fixed by suggesting a different furniture arrangement in the main hallway. When Harrison complained about productivity issues at his company, Rosa had observed the staff during her cleaning rounds and noticed patterns that led to identifying a middle manager who was embezzling funds. Rosa sees solutions where others see only problems, Harrison said. She understands systems, whether they're mechanical, financial, or human. These aren't the insights of a simple housekeeper. They're the observations of an engineer who never stopped thinking like one. The family watched in growing amazement as Harrison described incident after incident where Rosa had demonstrated intelligence, integrity, and wisdom that had directly benefited him. She had noticed when his medication schedule was making him confused and had diplomatically suggested he speak to his doctor. She had identified which of his business associates were genuinely loyal and which were simply opportunistic. She had even caught a contractor trying to overcharge for mansion repairs by presenting documentation that proved the unnecessary work. Most importantly, Harrison said, looking directly into the camera, Rosa never asked for anything in return for any of this. She never leveraged her knowledge for personal gain. She never used her access to my private information for advantage. She simply did what she thought was right every single day, because that's who she is. The video continued, with Harrison addressing each family member directly. To Marcus, "You've spent 20 years trying to prove you're worthy of inheriting my company, but you've never shown the wisdom to earn it. You see employees as resources to be exploited rather than people to be respected." To Patricia, "Your design business succeeds because you have genuine talent, but you've always resented that I didn't hand you everything without effort." To David, "You chose your own path, which I respect, but you've never forgiven me for not immediately validating your choices." Then Harrison turned his attention to Rosa, though she wouldn't see this message until later. "Rosa, if you're watching this, I need you to know that this inheritance isn't charity, and it isn't sentiment, it's recognition. You've earned this through 7 years of excellence, integrity, and quiet leadership. More than that, you've shown me what my company and my fortune should be used for: to create opportunities for others, to solve real problems, to make the world genuinely better rather than just more profitable." As the video ended, the conference room fell completely silent. Rosa sat with tears streaming down her face, not from joy or relief, but from the overwhelming realization that Harrison had truly seen her, not as a servant, but as a person of value and capability. Thomas Blackwood was the first to speak. "Well," he said quietly, "I think we all just learned something about our family that we should have known years ago." The week following the will reading transformed Rosa Martinez's life in ways she never could have imagined. Within hours of leaving the law office, news of the inheritance had leaked to the media, and by evening, her modest apartment in Pilsen was surrounded by reporters, cameras, and curious neighbors. The woman who had spent 7 years moving invisibly through a billionaire's mansion suddenly found herself the most talked-about person in Chicago. Rosa's first instinct was to hide. She unplugged her phone, closed her curtains, and sat in her kitchen trying to process what had happened. But hiding wasn't an option. Her landlord called to inform her that the building was being overwhelmed by media attention, and several news vans had blocked the street, preventing other tenants from getting to work. Edmund Steinberg arrived at her apartment building at 6 a.m. the next morning. Having fought his way through the crowd of journalists, he found Rosa making coffee with shaking hands, still wearing the same black dress from the will reading. "Mrs. Martinez," he said gently, "we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out how to manage this situation. The media attention is only going to intensify, and there are already people claiming to be your relatives calling our office." What Rosa didn't yet realize was that Harrison had anticipated this chaos too. Steinberg handed her another sealed envelope, this one containing keys to a penthouse apartment in downtown Chicago that Harrison had quietly purchased months earlier. The envelope also contained a letter written in Harrison's careful handwriting. "Rosa," the letter began, "by now you understand that your life has changed forever, and you're probably terrified. I remember my own fear when Nexus first became successful and I realized I couldn't go back to being anonymous. The difference is I had years to adjust. You have days. This apartment is yours now, a place where you can think clearly without the world watching. But more importantly, you need to know that you're not alone in this." The letter explained that Harrison had assembled a team of advisors specifically for Rosa, not just lawyers and accountants, but a media consultant, a security firm, and most importantly, a woman named Catherine Wells, who had worked as Harrison's personal assistant for 15 years before retiring. Catherine understood the complexities of managing vast wealth and could help Rosa navigate decisions that would have overwhelmed anyone. Moving to the penthouse felt surreal. Rosa had cleaned similar apartments during her early years in Chicago, but she had never imagined living in one. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, and the apartment came fully furnished with everything she could possibly need. More importantly, it provided the privacy she desperately needed to process what was happening. Catherine Wells arrived that afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had clearly been briefed extensively about the situation. "Mr. Blackwood spent considerable time preparing for this transition," she explained, as they sat in the apartment's elegant living room. "He understood that inheriting this kind of wealth isn't just about money. It's about responsibility, relationships, and navigating a world that will treat you differently than it did yesterday." The first challenge was immediate: the Blackwood family's legal response. Marcus had hired a team of attorneys to contest the will, claiming their father had been mentally incompetent and that Rosa had somehow manipulated him. They were demanding psychological evaluations, questioning her immigration status, and suggesting she had used undue influence to steal their inheritance. "They're going to make this ugly," Catherine warned. "They'll investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit you or invalidate the will. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Rosa thought about the question seriously. Her life in Chicago had been simple but honest. She had worked hard, paid her taxes, raised her children to be good people, and helped others whenever she could. She had nothing to hide. But she also understood that the media and the legal system could twist even innocent facts into something sinister. More concerning were the calls she was receiving from people claiming to be distant relatives from El Salvador. Her phone number had somehow been leaked, and dozens of people were suddenly claiming family connections, asking for money or demanding meetings. Some stories were clearly fabricated, but others were more difficult to dismiss. The isolation she had felt in her early years in America had made it hard to maintain connections with extended family, and now she couldn't be sure which claims were legitimate. The business implications were equally overwhelming. As the new owner of Nexus Technologies, Rosa was technically in control of a company with 40,000 employees and operations in 37 countries. The stock market had responded to news of the inheritance. With confusion and volatility, investors weren't sure what to make of a housekeeper inheriting one of America's largest tech companies. Catherine arranged for Rosa to meet with Nexus's senior leadership team, but the dynamics were complicated. These were people who had worked closely with Harrison for decades, building the company from his vision and strategic direction. They were respectful to Rosa, but clearly uncertain about her qualifications to make major business decisions. Some were openly skeptical, while others seemed to be positioning themselves to take advantage of what they perceived as her inexperience. James Crawford, Nexus's chief technology officer, was particularly challenging. He had been with the company for 18 years and clearly believed he should have been Harrison's successor. During their first meeting, he spoke to Rosa in the condescending tone people often used with non-native English speakers, explaining basic business concepts as if she had never heard them before. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, "running a technology company requires understanding complex market dynamics, regulatory compliance, and strategic planning. Perhaps you should consider selling your shares to someone more experienced." What Crawford didn't realize was that Rosa had been quietly observing Nexus operations for years. She had cleaned the offices after board meetings, had overheard countless phone calls and strategy sessions, and had developed her own opinions about the company's direction. Harrison's video message had been accurate. She did see patterns that others missed. "Mr. Crawford," Rosa replied calmly, "I notice you mentioned regulatory compliance. Are you referring to the European Union's new data protection requirements or the pending legislation in California? Because I remember Mr. Blackwood expressing concern about both issues, but I haven't seen comprehensive plans to address them." Crawford's surprise was obvious. He hadn't expected Rosa to be familiar with specific regulatory challenges, much less to ask informed questions about the company's preparation for them. But Rosa's biggest challenge wasn't the business, or the family, or even the media attention. It was reconciling her new reality with her sense of identity. For 52 years, she had defined herself by her work, her children, and her community. She was a woman who took pride in earning her way through life, who had never accepted charity, who measured her worth by her ability to solve problems and help others. Now she found herself in possession of more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, inheriting wealth she hadn't earned in any traditional sense. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, especially when she thought about the people still struggling with the same challenges she had faced for decades. Her son Miguel called from Northwestern University, where he was finishing his engineering degree, the education that Harrison had quietly made possible through his scholarship program. "Mom," he said, "I keep seeing you on the news, and I can't believe this is real. What are you going to do with all this money?" It was the question everyone was asking, but Rosa was beginning to understand it was the wrong question. The real question wasn't what she would do with Harrison's wealth. It was whether she could honor his faith in her by using it wisely. Harrison hadn't left her money. He had left her the tools to continue the work he had started, to solve problems on a scale she had never imagined possible. But first, she had to survive the storm that was building around her, and she was starting to realize that the storm was far from over. 2 weeks after the inheritance announcement, Rosa received an unexpected visitor at her penthouse, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychiatrist from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, arrived with a court order requiring Rosa to undergo psychological evaluation as part of the Blackwood family's legal challenge to the will. "I want you to know," Dr. Vasquez said as she set up her recording equipment, "that I've reviewed the extensive documentation of your late employer's mental competency evaluations. This examination is purely procedural, but the family's attorneys are hoping to find evidence that you somehow coerced or manipulated Mr. Blackwood." Rosa found the irony bitter. After years of being dismissed as intellectually inferior by the Blackwood family, she was now being accused of being cunning enough to manipulate a business genius. The evaluation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from her childhood in El Salvador to her decision-making. processes as Harrison's employee. What emerged during the session surprised even Dr. Vasquez. Rosa's responses revealed not just emotional intelligence and psychological stability, but a sophisticated understanding of human behavior that explained many of her insights about the Blackwood family dynamics. She had been trained as an engineer, but her real talent lay in reading complex systems, whether they were mechanical, organizational, or interpersonal. "Tell me about the last conversation you had with Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Vasquez requested. Rosa closed her eyes, remembering. It had been 3 days before Harrison's death, and she had found him sitting in his study, staring at a framed photograph of his late wife, Margaret, who had died 8 years earlier. "He told me he had been thinking about legacy," Rosa said quietly. "Not business legacy, but human legacy. He said he had built something that would outlast him, but he wasn't sure it would make the world better. He asked me what I thought was the most important thing a person could do with their life. What did you tell him? I told him about my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She's 83, lives alone, and her children never visit. Every morning, she waters the plants in our building's courtyard, even though no one asked her to, and the landlord doesn't pay for it. She does it because she wants people to have something beautiful to look at when they come home from work. I told Mr. Blackwood that Mrs. Chen understood something about legacy that most rich people miss. It's not about what you build for yourself. It's about what you make possible for others after you're gone." Dr. Vasquez made notes, but said nothing. Rosa continued. "Mr. Blackwood was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, 'Rosa, I think you just helped me understand something I've been struggling with for months.' I didn't know what he meant at the time. Meanwhile, the battle over the will was escalating in ways Rosa hadn't anticipated. Marcus Blackwood had hired private investigators to dig into her background, and they had uncovered details about her life in El Salvador that she had hoped would remain buried. The investigators had learned about her husband's murder, about the threats against her family, and about the desperate circumstances that had forced her to flee the country. But instead of damaging Rosa's credibility, these revelations began to work in her favor. The same courage that had enabled her to start over in a foreign country with 3 young children was now being recognized as evidence of her character. Immigration advocacy groups rallied to her support, pointing out that she represented the American dream in its purest form, someone who had overcome tremendous adversity through hard work and integrity. The media narrative was beginning to shift as well. Investigative journalists had started examining the Blackwood family's own history, and what they found wasn't flattering. Marcus's business dealings included several failed ventures that had cost investors millions, and he had a reputation for treating employees poorly. Patricia's design firm was facing lawsuits from clients who claimed she had overcharged for substandard work. David's academic career, while more respectable, was marked by a sense of entitlement that had alienated many of his colleagues. More damaging to their case was the discovery of a pattern of behavior toward Harrison in his final years. Hospital records showed that none of his children had visited him during his cancer treatments. Security footage from the mansion revealed that their visits had become increasingly infrequent and were usually accompanied by demands for money or business favors. The turning point came when Thomas Blackwood, Harrison's brother, made an unexpected announcement. In a press conference at his California office, he declared his support for Rosa's inheritance. "I've spent the last month investigating this situation," Thomas said. "Not because I wanted to challenge my brother's will, but because I wanted to understand it. What I discovered is that Harrison made the wisest decision of his life. Rosa Martinez embodies everything my brother valued: intelligence, integrity, and the ability to see solutions where others see only problems." Thomas revealed that he had independently verified many of the claims in Harrison's video message. He'd spoken to contractors who confirmed Rosa's insights about mansion maintenance, to Nexus employees who remembered her subtle but valuable observations, and to neighbors who described her quiet leadership in their community. More importantly, Thomas continued, I spent time with Rosa herself. This is not someone who was manipulated or who manipulated others. This is someone who earned my brother's respect through years of excellence that the rest of our family was too arrogant to notice. But Rosa's most significant challenge was still ahead of her. Nexus Technologies was facing a crisis that would test everything Harrison had believed about her capabilities. A major data breach had exposed customer information from millions of users, and the company's response had been fumbling and ineffective. Stock prices were plummeting, regulators were launching investigations, and there were calls for major leadership changes. James Crawford, the CTO, who had initially dismissed Rosa, was now scrambling to contain the damage. But his technical solutions weren't addressing the real problem. The company had lost the trust of its customers and the public. Traditional corporate crisis management wasn't working because people saw Nexus as just another tech giant trying to minimize liability rather than actually solving problems. Rosa watched the crisis unfold from her penthouse, receiving hourly updates from Catherine Wells. She could see patterns that the executive team was missing, connections between the technical failure and larger systemic issues within the company. But she also understood that any intervention from her would be scrutinized and criticized. The breakthrough came when Rosa remembered something Harrison had taught her about leadership during one of their conversations in his final months. The hardest part of being in charge, he had said, isn't making the right decision. It's making the right decision when everyone expects you to make the wrong one. Rosa called an emergency meeting with Nexus's board of directors. She arrived at the corporate headquarters for the first time as an owner, walking through offices where she had once cleaned floors and emptied trash cans. Employees stared as she passed, some with curiosity, others with skepticism, and a few with something that might have been hope. The boardroom was intimidating, a massive oval table surrounded by leather chairs, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The 12 board members were all men over 50, each representing different aspects of the technology and finance industries. They had agreed to meet with Rosa, but their body language suggested they viewed this as a courtesy rather than a serious business discussion. Crawford began the meeting by presenting a detailed technical analysis of the data breach, complete with charts showing system vulnerabilities and proposed security upgrades. His presentation was professionally polished, but missed the fundamental issue that Rosa had identified. When he finished, Rosa stood up slowly. She had prepared for this moment by reviewing every detail of the crisis, but more importantly, by thinking about what Harrison would have done. Not the technical response, but the human one. Mr. Crawford, she said, her voice steady, despite the weight of 12 pairs of skeptical eyes. Your analysis assumes that this is primarily a technology problem, but I think you're wrong. This is a trust problem, and trust isn't restored with better firewalls. The boardroom fell silent as Rosa's words hung in the air. Several directors exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether to take her seriously. Crawford's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. Mrs. Martinez, said Richard Pemberton, the board's longest-serving member, with all due respect, trust is rebuilt through demonstrating competence and security. Our customers need to know their data is safe. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Pemberton, may I ask you something? When you were a child, if you broke something valuable that belonged to your parents, what did they want more? For you to explain exactly how it happened, or for you to take responsibility and show them you understood why it mattered? The question seemed to catch Pemberton off guard. I suppose they wanted to know I understood the impact of what I'd done. Exactly, Rosa continued. Right now, Nexus is acting like a child who broke something and is desperately trying to explain that it wasn't really their fault. But our customers aren't interested in technical explanations. They want to know that we understand we betrayed their trust and they want to see what we're going to do to earn it back. She moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room, picking up a marker with the confidence of someone who had taught math to immigrant children for years. Mr. Crawford's analysis shows us how the breach happened, but it doesn't address why 47 employees ignored security protocols in the 6 months leading up to the breach. It doesn't explain why 3 different departments failed to communicate critical vulnerabilities they had identified. And it doesn't acknowledge that this breach was preventable if we had been listening to our own people. Rosa began drawing a simple organizational chart on the whiteboard. I've been reviewing internal communications from the past year. There were 17 separate warnings about security gaps from different levels of the company. Middle managers dismissed concerns from technical staff. Senior executives ignored recommendations from middle managers. And the board received sanitized reports that minimized risks. The room was completely quiet now. Rosa had their attention, but she could see skepticism in several faces. The problem isn't our technology, she continued. The problem is that Nexus has become a company where people are afraid to deliver bad news, where admitting mistakes is seen as career suicide, where the messenger gets shot, so eventually people stop delivering messages. Crawford finally spoke up. Mrs. Martinez, even if your analysis is correct, how does that help us with the current crisis? We have congressional hearings scheduled, class action lawsuits filed, and customers leaving in record numbers. Rosa turned back to the board. We tell the truth, all of it. We admit that this breach happened because we failed as leaders, not because our employees failed as technicians. We take full responsibility, not just for the technical failure, but for creating a culture where this kind of failure was inevitable. Board member Angela Foster, one of only 2 women who had served on the Nexus board, leaned forward. That sounds like public relations suicide. Admitting systematic leadership failures will make the lawsuits worse, maybe, Rosa acknowledged. But continuing to pretend this was just a technical glitch will make the trust problem permanent. And without trust, Nexus doesn't have a future anyway. She returned to the whiteboard and began outlining a comprehensive response plan that went far beyond technical fixes. Rosa proposed establishing an employee whistleblower program with external oversight, implementing transparent reporting systems that would make it impossible for management to ignore security concerns, and most radically, publishing detailed quarterly reports about every significant security issue the company identified, whether it had been exploited or not. You want us to publicly announce our vulnerabilities? Crawford asked incredulously. I want us to publicly demonstrate that we're actively identifying and addressing vulnerabilities, Rosa corrected. There's a difference between secrecy and security. Real security comes from having systems that work even when people know how they function. The debate that followed was intense. Traditional corporate wisdom suggested minimizing legal liability and controlling the narrative. Rosa's approach seemed to maximize both legal exposure and reputational risk in the short term, based on the theory that radical transparency would rebuild trust in the long term. But Rosa had an ace up her sleeve that she hadn't revealed yet. During her years cleaning Harrison's study, she had overheard countless phone calls with other tech industry leaders. She had listened to discussions about security breaches at competing companies, and she had observed how different response strategies played out over time. Mr. Pemberton, she said, do you remember the data flow breach 3 years ago? They followed exactly the strategy Mr. Crawford is recommending. Technical explanations, minimal admissions, focus on improved security measures. Pemberton nodded. Dataflow survived the crisis. They're still in business. Barely, Rosa replied. Their revenue dropped 30% and never recovered. They lost market share to competitors, and they've been struggling to attract top talent because engineers don't want to work for a company with a reputation for poor security culture. They survived, but they never thrived again. She turned to another board member. Mr. Jenkins, what about the response by SecureNet when they had their breach 5 years ago? Jenkins looked uncomfortable. SecureNet took much more aggressive approach to taking responsibility. They did exactly what I'm proposing, Rosa said. Full transparency, systematic culture change, external oversight of their security practices. It was painful in the short term, but where are they now? The board members exchanged glances. SecureNet had not only recovered from their breach, but had become the industry leader in cybersecurity, with companies paying premium prices for their services specifically because of their reputation for transparency and accountability. Rosa could see the shift in the room's energy. Her proposal was starting to be seen as strategic rather than naive. But the real test came when Crawford raised the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask. Mrs. Martinez, this is all very interesting in theory, but do you have any actual experience implementing this kind of crisis response? This isn't cleaning a house or managing a small community project. We're talking about a $4 billion company with global operations. The question was fair, and Rosa knew it was coming. But she also knew that Crawford was making the same mistake, that the Blackwood family had made for 7 years, assuming that her background meant she was incapable of understanding complex systems. Mr. Crawford, she said calmly, you're right that I've never managed a corporate crisis of this scale, but I've managed other kinds of crises that required similar skills. When my husband was murdered in El Salvador, I had to rebuild my family's entire life while protecting my children from ongoing threats. When I arrived in Chicago with no legal status and no recognizable credentials, I had to find ways to demonstrate my value to employers who assumed I was incompetent. When my son was struggling in school because of language barriers, I had to navigate an educational system that wasn't designed for families like ours. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. In every case, the solution wasn't to hide the problem or minimize it. The solution was to face it directly, take responsibility for what I could control, and build systems to prevent similar problems in the future. The scale is different, but the principles are the same. Board member David Chen, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting, finally spoke. Mrs. Martinez, assuming the board agrees to this approach, how would you propose to implement it? Who would lead this transformation? It was the question Rosa had been dreading, because it forced her to confront the reality she had been avoiding. Taking control of the company's response to this crisis meant stepping out of the shadows permanently. It meant accepting that she was no longer Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper, but Rosa Martinez, the CEO of Nexus Technologies. I would, she said simply. This is my company now, and these are my employees. If I'm not willing to lead them through this crisis, then I have no business owning their futures. The announcement of Rosa Martinez as the new CEO of Nexus Technologies sent shockwaves through the business world. Within hours of the board's unanimous vote, financial news networks were broadcasting live updates. Stock analysts were scrambling to assess the implications, and social media exploded with reactions ranging from admiration to outrage. Rosa's first day as CEO began at 5 a.m. in her penthouse, where she sat with Catherine Wells, reviewing the implementation strategy they had developed through the night. The plan was ambitious, a complete overhaul of corporate culture, radical transparency about the data breach, and a public apology that would either save the company or destroy it completely. The congressional hearing is in 6 days, Catherine reminded her. Senator Williams has made it clear that he's looking for someone to make an example of, and you're going to be the primary target. Rosa nodded, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. Senator Robert Williams chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Technology and Privacy, and he had built his political reputation by aggressively questioning tech executives who appeared before Congress. His staff had already leaked to the press that they viewed Rosa's appointment as a publicity stunt designed to distract from serious corporate malfeasance. But Rosa's more immediate challenge was internal. When she arrived at Nexus headquarters that morning, she found the executive parking garage filled with news vans and the building's lobby crowded with reporters. Security guards escorted her through a side entrance, But the sight of the media circus reminded her that every decision she made would be scrutinized by people who had already decided she was unqualified. The executive floor felt different when she walked through it as CEO, rather, than as the woman who had once cleaned these offices. Employees stopped conversations to stare as she passed, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. Several senior managers had already submitted their resignations, unwilling to work under someone they viewed as an unqualified interloper. Rosa's first meeting was with the company's legal team, led by Chief Counsel Amanda Richardson. Richardson had been with Nexus for 12 years and had managed every major legal challenge the company had faced. She entered Rosa's new office with a thick folder of documents and an expression that suggested she was dealing with an unpleasant but necessary task. "Mrs. Martinez," Richardson began, "I need to make you aware of the legal implications of your proposed transparency strategy. We currently face 47 class action lawsuits related to the data breach. Your plan to publicly admit systematic leadership failures could increase our liability exposure by hundreds of millions of dollars." Rosa had expected this conversation. "Ms. Richardson, what do you estimate our liability exposure will be if we continue with traditional damage control and lose anyway?" Richardson consulted her notes. "Assuming worst-case scenarios across all current litigation, we're looking at approximately $800 million in potential damages. And what if we implement radical transparency, take full responsibility, and work with plaintiffs to develop fair compensation programs?" The question seemed to surprise Richardson. That's not how corporate litigation typically works. Companies don't usually volunteer to increase their liability. But what if we did? What if instead of fighting every lawsuit, we acknowledge responsibility and work towards solutions that actually help the people who are harmed? Richardson set down her folder. "Mrs. Martinez, I've been practicing corporate law for 20 years, and what you're describing is essentially uncharted territory. It could set precedents that affect the entire tech industry." "Maybe that's exactly what the tech industry needs," Rosa replied. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from the communications department. Social media monitoring had detected an organized campaign to discredit Rosa's appointment, complete with hashtags like unqualified CEO and inheritance scam. The campaign appeared to be coordinated and well-funded, suggesting it wasn't just an organic public reaction. The source became clear when Catherine burst into the office with her laptop open to a news website. Marcus Blackwood had given an exclusive interview to TechCrunch, describing Rosa as a person of admirable character who has been thrust into a situation far beyond her capabilities. He expressed grave concern about the future of his father's company and suggested that Rosa should do the honorable thing and step aside in favor of experienced leadership. "He's positioning himself as the concerned family member," Catherine observed. "Publicly supportive, but privately undermining your authority." Rosa felt a flash of anger, but then remembered something Harrison had told her about dealing with business rivals. "Marcus is making the same mistake he always made with his father," she said. "He's assuming that public relations matter more than actual results." That afternoon, Rosa faced her first major test as CEO when Nexus's largest client, Global Financial Services, demanded an emergency meeting to discuss terminating their contract. GFS represented nearly 15% of Nexus's revenue, and losing them would trigger a cascade of other client departures. The meeting took place in Nexus's main conference room, with GFS's Chief Information Security Officer, Dr. Sarah Kim, leading a team of executives who looked like they were attending a funeral. Rosa entered with only Catherine Wells beside her, having deliberately chosen not to bring a large entourage of lawyers and technical experts. "Dr. Kim," Rosa began, "I understand your concerns about continuing your relationship with Nexus given recent events. Before we discuss contract terms, I want you to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and what we're doing to ensure it never happens again. What followed was unlike any corporate crisis meeting Dr. Kim had ever attended. Instead of minimizing Nexus's responsibility or deflecting blame to external factors, Rosa provided a detailed analysis of the systemic failures that had led to the breach. She explained how middle management had been incentivized to hide problems rather than solve them, how the executive team had been insulated from bad news, and how the company's culture had prioritized short-term profits over long-term security. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Kim interrupted, "this level of candor is unusual. Most companies in your situation would be limiting their admissions of responsibility." "Dr. Kim, you trusted us with your data and your customers' information. We failed that trust not because of a technical glitch, but because of leadership failures that we are now addressing systematically. You deserve to know exactly what went wrong, so you can make an informed decision about whether to trust us again." Rosa then outlined the specific changes being implemented. New reporting structures that would make it impossible for security concerns to be buried, external audits with public reporting, and a compensation system that rewarded employees for identifying problems rather than hiding them. The room was quiet as Dr. Kim and her team processed what they had heard. Finally, Dr. Kim spoke. "Mrs. Martinez, in 20 years of managing corporate vendor relationships, I have never heard a CEO provide this level of honest analysis about their own company's failures. It's either remarkably courageous or remarkably naive." "It might be both," Rosa admitted. "But I'd rather be naive and honest than sophisticated and dishonest." Dr. Kim smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Global Financial Services will maintain our contract with Nexus, but we want quarterly reviews using the same level of transparency you've shown today." As the GFS team left, Rosa felt a moment of relief. But Catherine quickly reminded her that the real test was still ahead. The congressional hearing would be broadcast live, and Senator Williams had a reputation for aggressive questioning, designed to create viral moments that would dominate news cycles. "He's going to try to embarrass you," Catherine warned. "He'll ask technical questions you can't answer, challenge your qualifications, and try to make you look incompetent on national television." Rosa spent the next 3 days preparing for the hearing, but not in the way most corporate executives would. Instead of memorizing technical details and practicing evasive answers, she focused on understanding the human impact of the data breach. She read every customer complaint, reviewed every news article about people whose personal information had been compromised, and met with Nexus employees at all levels to understand their perspectives on what had gone wrong. The night before the hearing, Rosa sat in her penthouse, looking out over Lake Michigan, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been an invisible housekeeper. Tomorrow, she would sit before the United States Senate and defend not just her company, but her right to lead it. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her son Miguel. "Mom, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you've already proven you belong there. Dad would be proud." Rosa smiled, thinking about her late husband and how he had always believed that the truth was more powerful than any lie, no matter how well crafted. Tomorrow, she would find out if he was right. The Hart Senate office building was packed as Rosa Martinez entered the hearing room. Cameras flashed, while protesters gathered outside with signs demanding tech accountability. She carried only handwritten notes, wearing the same simple navy suit she'd worn to Harrison's funeral. Senator Williams opened aggressively. "Today, we examine a massive data breach under the leadership of a CEO who inherited her position, rather than earning it through qualifications." His first question was designed to embarrass her. "Ms. Martinez, explain the specific technical vulnerabilities that caused this breach." Rosa's response surprised him. "Senator, I could recite technical details my team prepared, but that misses the point. This breach happened because 47 employees warned us about security problems, but our leadership structure prevented those warnings from reaching decision-makers. The technical failure was just a symptom. The real disease was a culture that punished honesty. For 3 hours, 12 senators grilled her with complex questions. Rosa never wavered, acknowledging every failure, accepting full responsibility, and explaining systematic changes being implemented. The turning point came when Senator Hoffman asked directly, "Your critics say you're unqualified. How do you respond?" "Traditional qualifications didn't prevent this breach," Rosa replied firmly. "Traditional leadership created the conditions that made it inevitable. Maybe the tech industry needs leaders who understand that technology serves people, not profit margins." When Rosa emerged from the building, Nexus employees had gathered with support signs. Maria Santos, one of the 47 who had tried reporting security concerns, spoke to cameras. Mrs. Martinez told the truth about working at Nexus and promised real change. That matters more than any traditional qualification. 6 months later, Nexus had become the industry leader in corporate transparency. Customer trust reached all-time highs, and employee satisfaction soared dramatically. Marcus quietly withdrew his legal challenge, privately admitting his father's decision was correct. Rosa kept both the penthouse and her Pilsen apartment, returning weekends to teach immigrant children math and help elderly Mrs. Chen with her plants. Looking over Lake Michigan from her CEO office, Rosa reflected on Harrison's final lesson. True leadership means creating conditions where everyone contributes their best work. The invisible maid had become the transformational CEO, proving that success comes from courage to do what's right, not from traditional credentials alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.